look at the last two components of Japanese history. Number one, so number six over here is the arts, culture, and religion of medieval Japan. Okay, during the period of disunity, okay, as I said from the last slide, you have the development of indigenization of Japanese culture. So, for example, here you have the culture and the traditional practice of tea drinking, and you have flower arranging or ikebana. Okay, so by the period of the Japanese culture, from the starting Heian period and continues until the medieval and even until the modern period, there is the adaptation of Japanese culture, the indigenization of Japanese culture. So basically taking something foreign and making it Japanese. So for example, the Japanese and Chinese language, although they share many similarities, the Japanese language will eventually develop its own structure, its own vocabulary. So for example, the Japanese will have two types of scripts, the kanji, which the Chinese can read, and you also have the hiragana, which is a more phonetic language. Okay, in terms of literature, you have the Tale of Genji. The Tale of Genji is one of the most important, one of the oldest classic and historical novel of Japanese literature. I have not read it, so I cannot say anything more about it. Now, the next part, the Buddhism in Japan. Buddhism in Japan, as I said before, you have a very unique form of Buddhism, how it developed in Japan. Okay, in medieval Japan, we have seen that the old Buddhism became new Buddhism of a distinctive Japanese Buddhist school. Okay, like in China, Buddhism in Japan eventually evolved into distinctly Buddhist Japanese Buddhist school. For example, Zen Buddhism was actually Chan Buddhism that became Zen Buddhism, and it focused a lot on meditation. Okay, in the West, we know more about Zen Buddhism than we know about Chan Buddhism. Okay, but the same cannot be said for Pure Land Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism or Jodo, okay, it is a Chinese school that became a Japanese school. It focuses a lot on the Nenbutsu, which means the recitation of the name of Amitabha Buddha. So in Japanese Buddhism, you have Namo Amida, Namo Amida Butsu. Okay, so in Chinese, you have Namo Omitofo. Okay, so basically the recitation of the Nenbutsu or the recitation of the name of Amitabha Buddha. And lastly, Nichiren Buddhism. Nichiren Buddhism is a totally unique Japanese Buddhist school. Okay, the Nichiren Buddhism do not have any Chinese equivalent in China because this Buddhist school, it is considered to be very nationalistic, focused exclusively on the Lotus Sutra. So even until today, if you have friends who follow Nichiren Buddhism, you have followers of Nichiren Buddhism in Malaysia. Okay, followers of Nichiren Buddhism need not be Japanese. So you can find in Malaysia, some of your Chinese friends may be Nichiren Buddhists, but in Malaysia, they will not be known as Nichiren Buddhists, but known as Soka Gakkai. Okay, so how do you tell Nichiren Buddhists apart? Okay, if you go to their house, for example, okay, a Japanese Buddhist house will have their Butsudan, something like this. If you go to a Nichiren Buddhist house or Soka Gakkai house, you see the Gohongzon, which in the middle, okay, this is the Gohongzon. The Gohongzon is the Lotus Sutra, and the Lotus Sutra is the most important text. Okay, so the most important mantra for Nichiren Buddhists will be Nam Myo Hyo Renge Kyo. Okay, so the Nichiren Buddhism or Soka Gakkai in today's world, okay, is uniquely Japanese. You will not find an equivalent in Chinese Buddhism. Now, similarly to China, the balance between Shintoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, it's an evolution of history. The up and down of one religion against the other, okay, depending on which period, what era, who is the emperor, who is the shogun. Okay, but basically the idea of Buddhism became very important in Japan due to Prince Shotoku of the Yamato dynasty. He encouraged cooperation between Shinto, Buddhism, and Confucianism. Basically, Shinto to give its relevance to the natural environment, Confucianism for the family ethics, and lastly, Buddhism to prepare for you after you die. So Confucianism gives you the ethics of the society, the social hierarchy, the harmony, and the duty and respect for authority. So the three religions are very important in Japan. But remember, very important, Confucianism is adopted in Japan, but the Japanese did not accept two forms of Confucianism. One is the imperial bureaucracy, and the second is the mandate of heaven. Now, we go to our last part on Japan. How Japan will its foreigners. Okay, Japan, when you look at Japan, similarly with China, they have relations with the next door neighbors. Okay, the next door neighbors over here, Korea is the nearest to Japan. Okay, before we continue on foreign relations, the most important part about foreign relation is that Japan is an island. So being an island, it is near enough to receive foreign ideas and foreign goods, but at the same time far enough to isolate itself from outside influence. So in the sense that when you want to take Buddhism, you can take parts and parcels of Buddhism, but you do not have to take everything of Buddhism. So similarly, you have ideas from the outside world, you take some and you leave out some. So the nearest country to Japan is Korea. Okay, and in Korea, the most important role of Korea in Japanese history is Korea will be the mediator. Throughout history, Korea has always been the mediator, okay, of China and Japan. So Korea, okay, has always been a vassal state of the Chinese dynasties. So for example, in this sense, Pekchek, okay, Pekchek is the kingdom in Korea, and it is where Buddhist images, Buddhist monks, sacred writings of Buddhism was sent to China. Okay, so Korea is the nearest country to Japan and is usually the middle person between China and Japan. So China is the bigger brother of Japan. Okay, the relationships between China and Japan have always been a love-hate relations from the very beginning, even until today in 2020. China was important to Japan. Okay, for example, the Chinese wanted Japanese swords. Japan wanted Chinese tradition, for example, the Chinese tea treaty, and they also wanted Buddhism. But you also have periods of animosity. For example, during the Yuan dynasty, the invasion of Mongols to Japan basically severed whatever good relations and ideas of China towards Japan. So, and the Chinese also didn't like the Japanese because the Japanese were pirates that terrorized the states, especially in the southern provinces in Guangdong and Fujian. The Japanese pirates were bandits that disrupted trade in southern China. Okay, so you have the Koreans, and then you have the Chinese. At the end of the 15th century, another new group of foreigners appeared in Japan. The Europeans arrived in Japan during the Morimachi or the Ashikaga period. The Europeans were merchants, they were mercenaries, and they were missionaries. Okay, the first Europeans that appeared in Japan were the Portuguese. Just like the Chinese, the Japanese look at the Portuguese and call them the southern barbarians. So there is one thing that is important. We totally forgot about the merchants, the mercenaries. There is one image, lasting image about the first Europeans in Japan, the arrival of Christianity. The arrival of Christianity, or in this case, Roman Catholicism, has altered Japan history. Okay, in the 15th and 16th century, Roman Catholicism was somewhat successful in Japan. But the arrival of Christianity in Japan's history has changed the evolution. Okay, we have seen in the last week's class on the arrival of Catholicism in China through Matteo Ricci. So Matteo Ricci was actually quite successful. But the success of Matteo Ricci was because he was able to incorporate Confucian ideas into Catholicism. They did the same thing in Japan, which made it Christian to be somewhat successful. But this early success, which you will see in History 102, will turn into one of the biggest massacre in early Japanese history. Okay, so in the 15th, the 16th century, okay, the Christians were hated. The Japanese who converted to Christianity were hated, and to become a Christian meant you are no longer a Japanese. But these are things that we will study in History 102, because Christianity will eventually be banned by the Tokugawa shogunate. The Tokugawa shogunate is not part of History 101. Now let's look at the last video clip and we will stop now. Okay, so since everyone has a lot of time now, okay, you can go back and watch. You can continue and watch Silence at Home. So one thing about Silence is that Silence actually is not part of our class, because the idea to ban Christianity in Japan only came about during the Tokugawa shogunate. So for our class today, during the Ashi, Ash, Ashikaga and Muromachi period, okay, Christianity in Japan was somewhat tolerated. Only during Tokugawa that Christianity was persecuted in Japan. Now, we are done with Japanese history. The history of Japan that we covered in our class basically formed ancient Japan, classical Japan, and medieval Japan. In these three periods, we have seen the most important thing about Japan is that it is near enough, far enough, and near enough. Near enough to receive outside influence, far enough in order to sieve what kind of influence that you want to take from the outside world. So that is all that we have to look at Japan. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good day after today. Thank you.